Hey, it's Jess, and welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. I'm a social entrepreneur, speaker, mother, and business owner, and I'm here because I believe in you, and I want you to live your full potential. My mission with this podcast is simple: to offer you perspectives, tools, and inspiration to help you live with more courage, rebuild after setbacks, and strengthen yourself from the inside out. So each week, I talk to thought leaders, authors, experts, and everyday amazing people who share their stories and outlooks that help you get from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow. Let's get started. Do you ever feel like you have something great inside of you, but you just aren't sure how to bring it to life? Do you ever need some clarity on how to get from where you are to where you want to be? I'm so excited to share a free guide I created just for you. This tool has helped me in my own times of struggle and doubt. It's called Your Future Self Guide. This mini course includes a future self visualization I recorded, a series of journal questions, and some insights from me about overcoming self-doubt and embracing self-leadership. You can download it for free at jessicalindberg.com/futureself. That's jessicalindberg.com/futureself. Let's get back to the show. Hey everyone, welcome to Becoming Heartstrong. My guest today is Sarah Freiesleben, and Sarah and I met at a conference that we were both at in Boston, which was really talking about disruptions in healthcare. And what I loved about what Sarah presented was really she was talking about systemic change and the work that she does. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you make change in systems that we're part of that we think need to be changed, from anything from like a business to an organization to even something more societal? So Sarah helps teams solve better problems and take wiser steps by facilitating dialogue around risks and opportunities. She serves as a non-expert, which I love that she calls herself a non-expert, because I think that's really such a wonderful way to bring people together. I love that. She builds bridges between technical and functional teams to define problems and requirements in relationships for solutions. She has a background in humanities with over 18 years working on global cross-functional projects in a wide variety of industries. She lives in Copenhagen, so we're doing this early morning for me, afternoon for her, and works as a consultant at Ramskov Consulting Group and is an industry fellow at the Technical University of Denmark. And she's currently writing a book, which we'll talk about. So welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, so I said I wanted to focus today on talking about influencing systemic change in our world, in our communities, in our places of work. So you work with teams that are navigating complex problems. Like, as we begin, what do you notice about teams that are successful doing that?
That is such a good question, because navigating complexity is very highly related to team dynamics and relationships. And what I've noticed about teams who are good at this is something that some people would think is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's actually their ability to have conflict, but have healthy conflict. So a lot of teams, as I see it, try to avoid conflict. So they try to keep everything kind of comfortable and cozy, especially where I live in Denmark, where coziness is almost like a virtue. They call it hygge. I don't know if that word has made it across, I think, to the US, but they're very interested in keeping cozy atmosphere. And that's great. And I love coziness, but as an American who's been here for about 15 years, I've started noticing that sometimes I miss the ability that in America, for example, people will kind of maybe have too much conflict. But at least when you have conflict, you have something to work with. You have difference of opinion, that you have something, then you have some ingredients to work with. And to be able to kind of address complex challenges, you need to be able to introduce a lot of variation of thought. So conflict is one way to access that type of thought. Of course, you don't want to have high conflict because those become counterproductive, but a healthy amount of conflict is actually really useful to navigating complexity. So teams who are able to trust each other enough to do that are usually more successful.
And I would think if they are using conflict productively, they're also pretty curious people about and they're working within the idea that they're going in the same direction.
Yeah, exactly. You need to have a shared goal, a shared purpose or end kind of vision for what you want to do. But then you need to be able to have healthy conflicts around how to get there. It's usually the how that where I think the healthy conflict can be the most productive.
So, I was thinking about this before I got on the podcast with you, is that when we talk about systemic change, I think one of the biggest challenges, or at least one that I see, is incentives to change, right?
Mm.
So you have a system like we were talking about healthcare at the conference we were at in Boston, and that's a huge system that's very entrenched. And we talked a lot about incentives. So when you want to make a change, there has to be incentives to change. So what happens when you're on a team of people? And I think some people who benefit from the system or benefit from the way that it currently is and are incentivized for it to stay the same. So how do you work through those situations where maybe one group thinks change is important and others like, no, it's working great for me now. I don't want to make a change. How do you help people navigate that or help them think about that?
That's such an important question. So most of the change programs I work on, it's the other way around. It's where the leadership, because that's usually who hires the consultants.
True.
The leadership is saying that they want to change, and I'm
Okay.
usually helping them make that happen. But it is interesting because in that work, what very quickly usually becomes apparent is that the leadership that has whoever it is that everyone has their story, right? Everyone has their narrative, and leaders usually have a narrative that we're the strategic ones, we have a vision for the future, and we want to be able to get there, so we're going to do a change management program to try to change the other people in the organization who, no one explicitly says this, but in the narrative, the story is basically, I'm the hero, I'm the leader, I'm the hero, I have a heroic vision. How do I convince these other people who might be laggards to follow me and achieve this vision? And what leaders often overlook is actually the people in the organization closest to the work also want change in the organization very much, usually sometimes more so than the leaders. But they're not in the position of power to be able to control that narrative and try to decide what gets rolled out. So one of the ways I try to help leaders actually have successful transformative change is by helping shepherd a process where they're able to hear the narratives on the ground, a wider variety of the narratives on the ground, so they can shape the strategy to be a more accurate strategy, a more achievable strategy, not because they're settling for something less than what they wanted, but because they're becoming more specific about what they actually need to do to be able to achieve success. Because the farther leaders get away from the problems, the less able they are to be specific about what it actually takes. And so usually the strategies that they cook up with some of the more classic consulting practices are kind of oversimplistic, you could say. They're usually, digitize more or use more AI, something very overly simplistic that no one can really disagree with, but don't really influence major change. But the type of problem you're asking is also more when the systemic challenges are kind of bigger than business problems. They're, like if you look at the medical industry in the United States specifically, you've got systemic problems on top of systemic problems on top of systemic problems. So you have hospitals that are trying to provide care to patients, which is the context we connected on, in a context where the health industry in the US is monetized based on paying per action, paying per thing you do to a person, which isn't at all conducive to caring for a person. It's conducive to running a business. And then the question becomes who can fix that? Who can solve that? Can a hospital solve that? Not by themselves. But then that's where you kind of get stuck, right? You say, but then if the hospital can't solve it, then they just throw their hands up and say, well, we can't solve this. This is a government problem. They point the finger to somewhere else in the system, right? That's the nature of systemic problems. So this just basically puts us into all kinds of what Daniel Schmachtenberger, a philosopher who I follow quite closely, calls multipolar traps. He didn't coin the term, but he talks about them a lot, which brings back to your original question. Where's the incentive? If we keep getting to this kind of wicked problem of a knot that can't be untangled, where can we place the incentive to actually say, we need to, everyone is now incentivized to fix this problem. And that becomes what we call like a wicked problem or intractable problem or impossible. And unfortunately, there's not an easy answer to how to solve that. Besides, what the approach I'm taking is trying to lean into, well, what can you do in a system besides nothing? And the answer to that I've come to from my studying with different systems thinkers is to start looking at the relationships in the system that you can influence and influencing those. Because what we do know about systemic conditions is that they're usually very intensely network based. And so that the solution practices that you want to apply to them aren't the traditional ones where you try to say, okay, here's the problem. Let's logically build up like an issue tree and try to logically solve it, because you can't. As soon as you push one solution, another side effect you didn't know about is going to happen. So instead, you need to lean into the relationships, try to find virtuous cycles and actually amplify those instead of vicious cycles, and basically just try to start local and continue experimenting based on what's happening right now.
Is there some wisdom in that, of the idea of controlling what you can control?
Yeah.
And this idea of like, what's your sphere of influence? Because what I'm getting to is, sometimes when we think about systemic problems or systemic change, I mean, it feels so big. It feels so far outside of maybe where we are. And just to kind of step us, one step to the side of that, I think where sometimes that breaks down, and you mentioned it, is there's different people at different parts of the system or the organization that something is a part of. I think sometimes we don't realize the expertise that each different person has, and we assume that the experts are at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we have to get curious about the different experiences that people are having within that system. And so I guess, how do we break this down to create conditions for influencing change? So I guess I'd break that down into two questions. Like, how can we do that as an individual human within wherever we are? And then how could we work as a team to say, let's create conditions for influencing change?
Yeah, so many important things you've just said when you were building up the context for that. I loved how you started with controlling what you can control,
Mm-hmm.
because what I sometimes am really grappling with is, the traditional management styles in organizations is control based ever since efficiency kind of became king when we started producing a lot during Taylorism, for example. So we had these control-based management models that were ubiquitous, basically. And now there's a tendency for leaders in organizations to say, okay, we know there's a lot of complexity, and we know we need to be able to navigate uncertainty and be agile, and all of these things are becoming really trendy. And so sometimes the hardest part of my work is actually going back to leaders and saying, no, but you should actually still try to control what you can control, because people often treat these different ways of navigating situations to be all or nothing, one or the other. Either you control everything and have this top-down hierarchical based system, or you have this rip out the hierarchy. There's no more structure. There's no more power over. Everybody just be agile and do the best you can and be innovative and fail fast, and all of these buzzwords come in. But what I actually am a strong advocate for is leaders taking the time to understand the difference and the different contexts where the different approaches are valuable. This is key, because you need both forms of, on the highest level, you need both ways of navigating. You need to understand things that are predictable in nature and can be ordered. And you need to be able to understand the things that are indeterminate in nature, and the relationships help influence the outcome. And then create conditions as a leader. You can actually adjust constraints or find enablers to help influence the conditions for those things to shift. For the stories you want to hear more of to start showing up, instead of the stories you want to hear less of, if you want to say it on the most macro level. But then to your point around what can you do as an individual versus as a group is also very interesting, because when you get into the situational leadership and you start saying, okay, these are the things I want to be able to control. That's an individual. An individual can do that. You could do it as a team. You could say, what are the main problems we're facing? You could start, there's so many different entry points. But they all sound very basic. What's our biggest problem? What do we want to do? What's keeping us from achieving our goals right now? That's one of the entry points I do when I conduct workshops. I just ask people, what's keeping you from doing what you want to do? What's constraining you right now? And you start organizing them based on which ones can you try to tighten control on. Let's say a team has major issues with understanding their role and responsibilities. We see that a lot in complex teams. You could take the parts you do know about their roles and start communicating those. Something very simple and basic that we used to do in the old days all the time. But we've kind of stopped doing it because nobody wants to be perceived as command and control type leader. But then once you've kind of cleaned those off your desk, you can start looking at, well, what things do we want to have dynamic dialogues about? And we want to then tap into the divergence of thought in our team and our organization to be able to understand that narrative better. So you want to do like a purposeful divergence. Now, this starts to sound a little bit like double diamond from design thinking. And it is very closely related to double diamond, the method that I use, except with double diamond, it talks about, divergence and then convergence. And I actually fully support the double diamond ideas, but in usage, what often happens is very popular here in Denmark, is everyone goes to a workshop and they say, okay, we want to have divergence of thought. So they plop some Post-it notes up on a screen, and then they say, okay, we've listened to everybody. Now let's pick the ones that are the right ones to converge on. And then we converge and move forward. But that's not really enough to navigate. It's not enough divergence, and it's not enough dynamicness, if that's a word. It's not enough invitation for dynamic, because you need to actually put those ideas and narratives into relationship with each other, into dialogue with each other. They need to be dynamically interrelating. So it's not about throwing a lot on the table and picking the best ones. That's not going to tap into the fruits of collective intelligence. Collective intelligence comes from combining the ideas in a way where everyone's kind of learning from each other and being open to learning things that they didn't know before, and then coming out on the other end with something that they've converged upon, and then being able to revisit that. Not perpetually, but until you've stabilized it. So the idea is to kind of bring the dynamic into a more stable state, recognizing stability doesn't last forever, but it lasts for a while. So that was a lot, but basically starting with understanding the situation first, and then using the different ways to act.
Well, what it makes me think of is, let's just say, in kind of an impractical way, is let's just say you have one view politically or socially on an issue, right? And so you've had that's your point of view, but then you have an experience, and the experience is contradictory to your former belief or to your belief. And so you have to take both of those into context, right? You have to say, well, I thought this because of whatever. Now I had this experience. Now I'm seeing this a little bit differently. Maybe both are true. Maybe one is true. Maybe one isn't. And now I have to sort of rework my thoughts, and I come to a new point of view that probably has a little bit of each into it, right? And so I think that's essentially what I hear you saying, and I think about it in a practical way with human beings. I think that that's what's missing a lot, especially in the US right now. We're facing an election, and there's so much systemic change that's needed. And there's also so many people just, putting their fists down in their camp. And I think that there's really a lack of curiosity. And I just always admire politicians, across both sides of the aisle, who will do what I just said. I thought this, I had this experience, I need to reconsider this. Now I'm here. And I think oftentimes, what I don't like that I see, is that we criticize people for changing their mind.
Yes.
And and I actually think it's a sign of intelligence to change your mind. It's a sign of intelligence to think differently. and you're not foregoing values or things that you think are really important, but you're taking into an account an experience. And that's what I hear you saying is important in organizations, is that people may say, I want to make this change, but I have to understand like the nuance of what's actually happening and what people are experiencing. And so I think that if we're not curious and having those kind of conversations, and like you said at the beginning of our conversation, sort of that grittiness, that friction, then we're actually not going to get to um, a viable solution or something. And it makes me think a little bit of, you and I heard Vivian Lee speak, and she wrote a book called The Long Fix, for those of you listening, and it's about the healthcare system. She does kind of a 360 view of all the different parts of healthcare and what could potentially be fixed through it. So she looks at patients, she looks at payers, she looks at health systems. And for me, as a person who's been a patient consumer of healthcare in a very significant way for a very long time, it was really interesting and good for me to look at the different points of view that she presented. And it's very easy when you're in one part of the system to say every other part is bad, right? Simplistically. But it's more nuanced to get curious about how the system works and why it works that way, and then think a little bit about how we can all maybe shift. Do you think people
Yeah,
are that open minded or willing to work through those things generally?
I really hope so. For me, this is the moral issue of our time, and I
Mm,
and I actually put that much weight on it that I call it the moral issue of our time, because I actually firmly believe that the ability to navigate nuance or even find nuance anymore is becoming lost in our society. And technology is also accelerating that speed at which it's being lost with
mm,
the narrative wars that are happening in the media, the misinformation wars. So exactly what you described, the ability to change your mind is actually such a beautiful thing. So I really admire Winston Churchill, even though I know there's reasons that I shouldn't. But I admire a lot about him as a leader. And one of the things he said when he was challenged with changing his mind, he said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?"
mm,
But it doesn't even have to be that a fact changes. It could be like you say, you think something and then you go along and an experience happens and you realize that your opinion about it is getting more complicated.
mhm,
And I would say, unfortunately, but also fortunately, because this is a necessary element for this, it's very energy consuming to carry around nuance, I think, and harder for groups to do. So it's much easier for groups to rally around us versus them thinking, which is, when we go back to the idea of conflict and the value that is available in conflict. The value available in conflict is that ability to have this kind of nuance sharing, this learning back and forth. But we know that the foundation of that has to be trust. To be able to even be curious, you have to first of all understand something enough to care, which is
mhm,
also part of the problem. Some people lack curiosity because they simply don't understand what you're talking about. Because they either they purposely want to keep their mind closed or they just lack the ability to be able to open it. But then you also need to be able to respect the fact that the other person might have something to say that isn't the same as what you think, and be able to engage in that dialogue without being afraid that, like, now at the end of this dialogue, I'm going to lose because you're going to have to win. But if people are approaching dialogues as this like win lose situation, which is what happens when you get into these polarized debates, like you talk about with the election. I mean, I can't really even imagine a situation where someone who's a Trump supporter or a Harris supporter could even have such a nuanced conversation, because it's being treated like such a um, you're either with us or you're against us kind of situation. But for me, the fact that nuance is this waning skill that we need to have, and this ability to embrace paradox, that's a reason to actually purposely look for it and attend to it. So you mentioned I'm writing a book, and actually that's how I start the book. I started the book by talking about paradox and the importance of understanding that two things cannot agree with each other, but both be true. Because I think that's the key to all of this. And then recognizing that that is going to be energy consuming, and then choosing to spend your energy on it. It is a choice. And that's what organizations, I think, also get wrong, because we've been so obsessed with efficiency being our main prerogative that, if I try to come as a consultant and say, hey, I have something for you, it's going to make you actually less efficient, but more successful in the long run. It's not really easy to sell. They're like, no, we only want to be efficient. Why are you not trying to sell us efficiency? So I've actually started making it very clear to my customers that if you're looking for easy solutions, I'm not your consultant. There's 99% of other consultants are that consultant. So go get one of those consultants. I'm not here to give you an easy solution that a smart person can just come up with in isolation. I'm here to help my customers figure out how to apply their energy to the right things.
When you say that you think this inability to embrace nuance is like the moral issue of our time, I think that's how you put it. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why you believe that, and like what you're seeing that makes you think that? Because I agree with you. I think that I've never thought of it that way, but I think that you are on the right track with it. I'd love to hear more from you about that.
Yeah. I briefly mentioned Daniel Schmachtenberger earlier, and I don't think I really elaborated very much, but when I talked about multipolar traps, and he talks about how essentially the idea of, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of a double bind, but basically, if I do this, it's going to be bad for me, but also if I do this other thing, it's going to be bad for me. So you're in a double bind. But if you take a double bind and you put it at scale, that's what our society is in right now. We're in this multipolar trap of, let's say, if a CEO wants to make the right choice for the environment, they are very much more than likely not making the best choice for their budget. Now, a lot of people will say, you should be able to also do innovation that's good for the environment and make a profit. Sure. There are situations where you can, but there's also a lot of situations where you can't. And people don't want to talk about those because of the fact that the others are possible. They kind of don't want to talk about the fact that the others are very probable. So what we have are all these leaders that are not able to make these trade-off decisions, because if they do, their company is going to fail. And then they won't be a leader anymore. They won't have their salary anymore, but they also won't have a job anymore. And they won't be able to continue doing what they do in their life. So their immediate gains are gone, and their ability to influence something are gone. But we are in a situation right now in the world, and it's very depressing to talk about. And I struggle with it a lot personally. And the reason I don't work closer to it is because of protecting my own mental health, basically. But we are in a situation right now where the meta crisis, as they call it, but the combination of all the different crises that humanity are facing are putting us in a scientifically explainable path towards humans going extinct. And people don't really want to talk about that very much, which is understandable because it's super depressing. But although we don't want to talk about it, it's still true. They've now quantified which is the later, quantification comes after things are emerging for quite a long time. They've now been able to quantify the fact that we've exceeded 6 out of 9 of the planetary boundaries within which humanity can survive. We've exceeded them already. So without actually making major changes, the humanity isn't going to survive. And when I think about that problem, and I think about how sad it makes me, especially after becoming a mother, not to imply that one needs to be a parent to feel these kinds of deeper connection, but humans, we have this ability to feel a deep connection with things way bigger than ourselves, other humans, even from times before and after us. When I think about that, I become potentially paralyzed with pain. And so for me, one of the solutions for my own life has been what part of this problem can I, without losing my mind, try to influence? And when I look at how we solve problems, I actually think that's a major contributing factor to the meta crisis, because we are trying to solve problems in ways that cause other problems that are worse. We think we come up with these great solutions, then we productize them, we try to make a profit off of them and turn them into businesses, and then that little bit of value that they probably did have in that one context, we try to apply it to other contexts, and then it ends up creating other problems. And I think if we could step back and try to be more coherent in the way that's not the word I'm looking for. If we could be more having a long-term perspective on the solutions we're bringing to the world, I think there would still be enough money to be made and real-time luxury to be had. But we would have to give something up. And my plight, my why, is to kind of help focus on helping people attend to the right types of problems. But as it relates to things that are actually the day-to-day happenings in companies. And that's been a big step for me, because when I first went on this journey, it was like, I want to solve like the biggest problems in the world. I want to find the problems that are going to be the most impactful and solve those. And I met with a lot of people who were also trying to do that. And you know what? We were all basically, I don't like to use the word unemployed. We were all struggling entrepreneurs. There's a lot of people out there that want to save the world.
Yeah.
And we are all really, really passionate people. The problem is that you're not going to save the world sitting on your couch talking to other people who want to save the world. That was the realization I came to for me. So I said, okay, how can I find a way to reconnect with the status quo? This is around when I turned 40, I had kind of a midlife crisis and quit my corporate job and started my own company and was trying to save the world. Then I said, okay, well, where can I reconnect to the status quo and try to improve it in ways that can help people in their day-to-day make better choices, make better decisions. So moving from like a macro, trying to solve this big, huge problem, to a more micro, acting locally on problems that I actually genuinely believe in, helping people solve. But you asked I'm not blaming you, but you asked questions that really make me think. So I start rambling. I'm sorry about that.
No, I think that something that you just said really made me. So this is something that I have thought about a lot on the season of my podcast. And actually I've talked to a lot of different leaders, and I'm really in the background, like trying to think about what's the themes that I've learned from people that I've talked to this season. But I think one of the themes is self-leadership. And that's something that I think a lot about in my own life, about the importance of how we lead ourselves, and grounding that to our values and what we think is what our values are and what's really important to us. And I think, as I look around, where I think we go a little haywire is everything's out here. We're waiting for some system to change. We're waiting for someone to tell us this is the right idea. We're looking to this party to do this or this party to do that. Instead, it's what you just said. It's, what do I believe? What are my values? How can I take what I deeply believe in and what I believe needs to be changed, and how can I start today in my own sphere of influence? And sometimes I think, and I've reflected a lot on this in the last 10 years. I've done a lot of stuff in advocacy work around healthcare, and it's a very frustrating place to be, because there's so many changes that need to be made. And I think that's like, we could do a whole podcast on that topic alone. But at the end of the day, it's like, how can I help people where they're at with what they're facing, perhaps shift their minds a little bit and rethink who they are and how they want to show up in the world. And I think you see, it's like, if everyone collectively would do that, I think we would advance together versus waiting for the thing outside of ourselves to change. And you said this in when we were in Boston and I wrote it down, it's like, you're like, we are the system.
Mm.
And I think that's such it's an empowering idea, because if we say that, if you and I say we are the system, well, then the responsibility is on us. We better get to work. We better be about something that shifts something in our families or in our communities or in our places of work. And I think at least in my view, and here, I think we've given our power away essentially too much to these larger systems, instead of deciding for ourselves and then making those requisite choices based on our values, based on curiosity. I think curiosity is completely lost in our culture, and moving forward that way. So it's like, instead of us versus them, what if we said it's us? And then how would we act?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's super hard
Super
because
hard.
it is also them. If it makes sense.
It
So
is them. Yes.
it's not untrue that there are so many things outside of our control that suck.
Yes. Yes.
And they can become so paralyzing, right? And also such distractions, like
Mm-hmm.
from doing what we can do. And so it's not at all to try to paint some toxically positive idea of like, we're going to be the change we want to see in the world, and that we're going to, in a few weeks' time become successful at that. Because I don't
Right.
think we are,
No.
unfortunately. I think that maybe what I've tried to let go of is this dream that there is going to be a point where you look back and kind of like a good movie, or like, the good guy won, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to probably happen. It's more about like, well, what can we influence? If we picture ourselves like a bunch of ants, on an ant hill or something, doing our part, they're probably not thinking about the system, right? They're probably just thinking about doing their part to whatever it is that day that they do, carry something up the hill. And for me, that's a almost daily thing I have to remind myself, because suddenly, you'll jump on LinkedIn. I actually really learn a lot from LinkedIn. I have a love-hate relationship with it, because I also see a lot of things and I'm like, oh, why are these people focusing on this? It's so
Mm-hmm.
not what we should be focusing on. And then I get myself all worked up, and then I have to stop and say, this is a distraction. This is a distraction from what I'm focusing on and what the influence I want to have in my sphere of influence. But I also, you said, if everyone would just collectively do this, like, I can't kind of also feel like part of my why is to influence, to use words to influence people collectively doing stuff. Because I think I have a way with explaining things sometimes, at least, and that may be one of the skills I can apply to the mission. And so I try to use my words to influence things, but also recognize the need to use the words to promote the thing I want to have impact on, the intention that I want, instead of using my words to contribute to the conflict that's a distraction from the intention, if that makes sense.
Do you think that some of this conflict that you're talking about is that we, on a human level, have sort of, dehumanized is a big word, but that we don't really, we see people as issues, or we see people as a point of view, or we see people as a side instead of seeing them as people? Like, do you notice that? I think that's true in politically, as I observed things, but do you think that's true in businesses as well? Or
Yeah,
is
for
that a
sure.
step too far?
Sure. I would have
Yeah.
never put those words on it before, but it's a super interesting question. I think, yeah, that must be what is kind of happening, because you kind of, I like to think of it as narratives, right? Like, to tie it into your example of like the politics again, it's just so easy because it's right here.
Yep.
I saw a clip today on LinkedIn about I'll probably get it wrong. It was something like white guys for Harris, white dudes for Harris,
Oh,
I think
yeah.
it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a kind of like stereotypical men that maybe there was a farmer, a truck driver, and they all kind of had roughneck accents, and they were kind of like, surprise, I'm voting for Harris. And,
Mm.
what was kind of cute about the video was that it was playing with these narratives, right? Because it was basically like, picture this guy, he's a gun owning farmer, and he's voting for Harris. And it was kind of overtly playing with these stereotypes. But it's also pointing to something really interesting, right? How quickly we make these snap judgments about, oh, that person is voting for Trump, so they must be like this, and that person is voting for Harris, so they must be like this, or that person goes to this restaurant, or that person does this on the weekend, they must be like this. And then I think that definitely these narratives also translate into work big time. I think the biggest fascinating thing I find about large organizations that I work with is that the leaders in them, they come up with these strategies. I'm often very close to helping them create these strategies, or usually I'm actually the kind of person they bring in once they've already decided what they want it to be and they want to roll it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always so curious about how I actually think they're convinced that they are accurate with their strategy, right? And that they truly want this beautiful change that they're saying that they want. And then at the same time, seem to create this narrative without meaning to. I think they actually do genuinely care about their people by and large, but then somehow subconsciously create this narrative about the fact that they're resistant to change. Like I talked about in the speech at Harvard when we met, that they're resistant to change and we're the ones that know better. So we're going to help them overcome their resistance to change instead of like, well, if you truly, really respected your people, when they do speak up, it's really common in Denmark for companies to make one of their values be speak up. But then when people speak up, I don't think that's usually very good for them, to be honest. I've been that person a lot. It hasn't been good for my career. I've had to learn the hard way that speaking up they don't actually mean that. They don't actually mean that when they say speak up. What they mean is we want you to believe that you should speak up. But when you actually do it, then you break the narrative that they have, especially if what you're saying isn't lining up with the narrative that the simple narrative that they've constructed that they want. So then they push you out because they think you're going against the narrative. But in reality, you're trying to support the narrative. Usually the people who are speaking up are usually also wanting the change, but they're speaking up because the way you're going about trying to get the change isn't the right way. It's not working. So I think we all are guilty of it. And that's also what the talk was about when we met, was kind of how are we limiting possibilities because we make these stereotypes and these narratives about people and we don't actually find out what they really think or what they really are about.
I think that's such an interesting thing that you brought up, that's like, we value speaking up, but we really don't want you to speak up. And I think that is I see that a lot, I think, in American culture today. And I see that in the patient space. It's like, we want your voice as patients, but we're really not going to do anything about it. We want to make you feel good. We'll bring you into the conversation, but we're not going to change anything. Hey there, it's Jess, and we're taking a brief pause to highlight this show's sponsor, the Heartstrong Collective. It's more than just a nonprofit. It's a social movement I founded to inspire people worldwide to embody resilience and grow through challenges. Through the Heartstrong Collective, we're dedicated to empowering caregiving families, investing in the next generation, and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. To learn more about our mission and how you can get involved, visit us at theheartstrong.com. One of the things that I have noticed, I'm a very curious person, and I see life as a lot of nuance just based on my life experience and kind of how I am as a person. But what I've noticed is you're in a group of people, and they will just go on and on and on about one side of politics, for example. And I see this more on one side than another right now. And it's like they just assume that everyone sitting at the table thinks the same way that they do. And
Mm.
they don't consider the fact that maybe someone thinks differently than them, and so
Mm.
they go so far as to trash the idea of the other side, you know?
Mm.
And
Mm.
they're so, and it's like, and I just had this experience at an event that I was just at that I noticed. And I'm like, well, you're so free to say your point of view, assuming that everyone agrees with you. And you also think you're open minded, but that's a very closed minded way to live.
Mm.
And instead of saying, well, this is what I think, but and so I think it, like, if anyone's listening to this podcast, I think what you should get out is like, be a person of nuance. Like, don't be
Mm.
afraid of nuance, and don't be afraid to allow in different points of view, and be really curious why someone thinks that,
Yeah,
instead of assuming that because they like this person or that person that they're a bad person, and I think all sides of things do that, and they create that. And I think when you posted something on LinkedIn about like the misinformation situation, which I think is a whole other conversation. But then someone commented, they said, well, maybe the goal of misinformation is, I always think things are of a 30,000-foot view above the issue that we're having, and it creates divide. And I think that there is so many things in our culture that divide us and that want to, on both sides of, or whatever side you're on of things. And I think it happens in businesses, I think it happens in organizations, and it's like, maybe the solution or the antidote to that is just for us to just be curious people, and
yeah,
to model that curiosity, and to allow people to have differing points of view, and then to be curious about why they have them. I-
definitely. I think when I work with teams that are having a conflict, I'm not a conflict professional as such, but I often work in situations that are high conflict, or I've been brought in during a state of conflict because they're trying to figure out the way forward. And one of the tools that I use, and it's the same exact tool that I use when I'm writing, for example, when I write or when I create a speech, I'm actually trying to find some sort of nuance to bring into the talk or into the writing, because otherwise I don't see the point
hmm.
of of writing or doing
Mm-hmm.
something or saying something if you don't think you're kind of highlighting a nuance. But what I do is I try to guide people through that process of finding that nuance. And it's always harder to find it when you're inside it. So if you're the one deeply enthralled in a conflict because that team is, doing the wrong thing,
Mm-hmm.
and your team is doing the right thing, and you're really like, you've got all the loyalty of your teammates on your side, and you even get like, it's actually a way of bonding,
Mm.
on a team, to be able to talk crap about the other team,
So
and
true.
all that going for you, right? So it's easier as an outsider like me to come in and say, okay, I've heard both of your sides, and now we're going to create an and statement that's going to find this encompassing perspective that, or question, that's able to bind both of your truths, both of the truths that you're sitting with that are actually probably accurate. Most of the time
Mhm.
in professional context, there aren't actual real bad guys and real good guys or ladies. It's basically both sides have pretty sound arguments, and they're just not seeing each other's point of view, right? So what I'm usually doing is just constructing that nuanced and statement that combines the team together. But it usually requires a little bit of sharing of perspective, so the other team can say, oh, okay, I didn't see it like that. I mean, when I think about arguing with someone, for example, if
Mhm.
you think about arguing with your partner, I mean, I think one of the things that makes my relationship with my husband great is actually how we argue, when we argue. And he's probably the first person in my life that I've actually been able to argue with in a way that I think is healthy. Because when we argue, it doesn't happen very much. What we immediately start doing is sharing what was going on for you when that happened. And genuinely like hearing what the other person says and then realizing, oh, what you were going through was a completely legitimate
Mm-hmm.
thing. And also what I was going through was a completely legitimate thing. And they weren't combining really well in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Hmm.
what it takes. But you're right. It's super hard when you're sitting at a table or something. Honestly, it's this is going to sound kind of mean, but it's one of the reasons I left the US because it was during, I think, the Bush administration. And I couldn't tolerate the polarization of conversation. I
Hmm.
could feel it in my bones. I couldn't tolerate it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So my husband is a contracts lawyer. He does contracts for a living in like the construction world, and so very non-political, but he always says is that when you're negotiating something, the best solution is when everybody gives something. Nobody gets everything they want. He's like, then you know as a lawyer that you've done a good job. And he's really taught me that idea, because if everybody's getting what they want, if one side's getting then the other side's upset. But if everyone finds a path forward that's somewhat nuanced, and there's some give and take, like that's probably a pretty good path forward. And I always think of that when you think of all these things that we're discussing, is like that idea that it's probably a little bit of give and take. But in order to do that, right, you have to have a back and forth. You have to argue it out a little bit. You have to listen to other people's points of view. And so I'm curious, like when you work with these leaders and you are brought into an organization and they do a good job and you're like, wow, I really admire the way they did this. Tell me about what that leader is like and what some characteristics of them are.
Okay. So this has happened recently. That actually, I think it's because I'm also getting better at finding the right clients, because I've also learned that it's easier to find clients that actually are interested in this kind of thing versus trying to kind of convince people that don't understand what I'm talking about, like to care, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. So to try to find people who are already curious about systemic change and understand um, that they, for example, even though they're a top leader, could learn something. I think the number
Mm.
one thing, I think some people call it a growth mindset. I'm not really into mindset terminology. But the number one thing is a person's ability to realize that they, no matter how high up they are, need that they have things to learn, that they have the capability of learning. And the best ones are the ones who are eager to learn. Like
Mm.
they want to surround themselves with people who think differently than them. And not just for show, not just to pretend they did, but to actually hear those other perspectives. And then on top of that, so the combination is very hard to find, because usually you have people who are either really open and they want to hear everybody's opinion, or people who are very command control. But the best leaders I've seen are the ones that are also able to then make decisions and
Mm.
actually sometimes make really difficult ones, and um, break a few eggs. I mean, not try to please everybody. Um, so that combination to me is the perfect leader. Somebody who knows when to try to control something and when not to.
And is curious, it sounds like, about different
Exactly.
points of view.
Knows that they need to learn, but also knows that people are looking to them to make decisions. And
Mhm.
once they've learned and collected as much information as they can, acting. Because we have kind of in Denmark, it's very easy to find leaders who are open. They want to hear a lot of stuff. It's very cool to be non-hierarchical here in Denmark. And I would especially say the male leaders, which is the majority of leaders in Denmark, we also struggle with gender inequality here. Um, they almost err on the side of being the cool, I want to hear everybody's opinion guy. But very difficult then to turn it around and then actually make a decision. So a lot of them listen a lot and then don't do the hard thing that we're all like hoping they're going to do.
Mm.
I was asked to speak to a group of top Danish leaders once at a networking event. And I was super excited about systemic change. And I was super excited. And it was all, VP and above. 100% males. One woman walked in about 10 minutes into my speech. I was like, oh, thank goodness. And I gave my talk, and at the end, this guy like raises his hand and he's like, yeah, but I mean, this is all great. I would love to be able to do that. But, I have a board that I have to report to. And I just was like, yeah, you do. You need to put on your big boy pants and like tell them hard stuff and like push back and tell them reality. That's why we look to you. That's what we expect of our leaders. But it was just another person, blaming the next person up for not being able to do the thing. And I'm like, well, that's not good leadership. That's not good leadership. We're expecting you to use your power. That's what we're expecting. I went home very depressed that night, to be honest.
Do you think in organizations that well, let me step back. What it sounds like to me that you're talking about is someone who has courage.
Yes.
Sounds to me that someone who is open-minded and willing to look around and listen to different points of view, but then who has the courage enough and you'd say the spine enough maybe to make a hard decision, knowing that they're not going to please everyone.
Yeah.
Because you never can.
Exactly.
And so it sounds like you're looking for people who have courage. Do you think that a lot of leaders today have courage? I feel like that's almost a dumb question, but what do you observe?
Wow. I mean, the ones that I observe, most of the ones that I have the privilege of working with do have courage. I guess no one's probably courageous all the time, right?
No, we never are.
And there's probably times where I probably have a higher threshold of or a higher expectation than most leaders are willing to do. Like I would like more courage. I would like to see more courage, to be honest. But I also have like a high risk profile. Like I am the kind of person that's like, if this job isn't like meeting my values, I'm out of here. Even though I don't have a job lined up and don't know what I'm going to do. And then I'll be depressed for a while and then pick myself up again and figure out what to do. Whereas a lot of people are much more into like stability and making sure they can feed their families and things. But I wish that there was more leadership that was like, no, if this isn't right, I'm gonna use my voice and take a stand, and if not, I'm gonna leave. I mean, I quit a job once because of an ethical dilemma that I tried to convince the senior leaders around me to take note of, and they wouldn't. So I left, and I was very vocal about it. And one of the more senior leaders in the organization came up to me on my last day and just told me verbatim, I'm really envious of you. And I said, why? And he said, because you have more courage than I do. You have the courage to do this. And I'm like, are you kidding me right now? So you're like admitting to me that you also see this problem and you're not going to take a stand. And he literally said to me, my mortgage is too high.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he's still a senior executive in Denmark today.
He's still there. He's still paying his mortgage.
Yeah, he's still paying his mortgage.
but I think what I'm observing is you said in the previous example of someone, they said, but I have a board. Right. And so I wonder if as leadership, at some point there's a top down in everything, we just have to resign ourselves to the fact that that's true. And I wonder if the leaders in our world really don't want courageous people in their companies. They want, and this is a blanket statement. I wonder if there's some of that, and that's what brings a group of people to say, "Oh, this is so great, Sarah, but I have to pay my mortgage, but I have to do that." And so maybe we need to be creating more environments that have respectful disagreement and have nuance and have curiosity and allow for some of those things to be part. And so I guess as I'm sharing this, if you're listening and you're in a position to allow for those things, like allow for them, have those conversations and be open to different points of view, and then have your values and make your choice as the leader. Like, we respect that. But if we have a room full of people saying that, then I think like there's some things that are a bit concerning about how we're operating as human beings.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, of course, it also goes back to what's motivating people. And if
Sure.
we
What the
also have to
incentives
recognize
are.
not everyone is motivated by the meta crisis and trying
Yeah.
to, and many people also are willfully blind to less long term thinking. I mean, you can even tie it into, I would actually take it so far as to say, what we usually, when we think of courage, we usually think of like, a man on a battlefield, right? I would actually say the more courageous, the kind of courage I'm talking about that I've seen is actually coming more from female leaders
Mm.
or
Hmm.
or leaders. I don't want to differentiate between gender, but you could say some of that feminine characteristics, because feminine characteristics are often looking for more long term instead of short term gains. They're usually much more like kind of receptive and open instead of kind of power over type situations. And I think the problem is that there aren't enough spaces for female leadership to really like thrive. I
Hmm.
think it so far, at least in the communities I'm circulating in, because um, we're still looking at power as like a masculine kind of like power over how are you gonna produce, how are you gonna make a lot of money, how are you gonna do it's very dominant approach. But I think there's even space on boards when people are saying the board isn't going to allow this. I've also worked on boards, and they're also just like steering committees or executive boards. It's also how you present an argument that is going to cause them to be receptive or not receptive. And there are ways to present arguments that can persuade them to make better choices. But that requires courage. And that's one thing I'm trying to get good at, is figuring out what are the smartest ways, knowing what we know about their limitations, to present arguments in ways where they understand the trade-off choices that they're making. Because sometimes we're not presenting their arguments in ways that are very clear. If you just present an argument like how much money you're going to make and how fast are you going to make it, that's basically the ingredients we're using to make choices in businesses. And that's just not good enough.
No.
So we need better ways to present arguments to boards and steering committees.
And that's where like the female energy, I think, comes into play, right? It's a little bit, I think, often more holistic, I would argue. I mean, I'm probably biased in saying that. Um, but it is that more long-term view, and it's a little bit more, I mean, dare I say, and this is, and again, not to be polarizing, but sometimes more inclusive, or it's more about the big picture. I think that we tend to bring that. And so I think all of these things are so interesting, Sarah. I think these are really important conversations to have in our world today. I think that just even if no one gets anything else out of this podcast, I hope they get that nuance is important, and it's important to be curious about nuance and curious about people, and also perhaps to be curious about yourself and what you think and what your place in the world is and what your values are, and then just act accordingly wherever you find yourself. So before we close, I would love to ask you just two questions about yourself that I ask all of my guests. And um, one is, what is a belief or practice that has really helped you get to where you are today that's very important to you?
So I study embodiment, or you could call it
Mm.
somatics, and
Yeah.
that has been a life changer for me. So it helps me it helps me understand. Yeah, it's hard to explain. The coach I work with describes it as aligning your head and your heart and your stomach. And then when these three things are aligned, you're grounded.
Mm.
Because before I started studying embodiment, if you said to me, you should be grounded, I would have not said I disagree with that, but I wouldn't know what it meant. But through some of these exercises, I've started understanding what it means. And it's been a really strange journey because our bodies, I guess they've been communicating to us our whole lives, but I haven't really known how to hear it. And once you start learning how to hear it, it's you can't not hear it, and it's really filled with a lot of wisdom and a lot of signals to like help you understand basically what you were just saying. What we need in the world is to also just understand ourselves better, and then what are our values? Well, embodiment has helped me figure
Mm.
that out for myself.
Can you give just a quick example of embodiment and like kind of feeling something in your body and just in general that's helped you? Because I think somatics are so interesting as well, and I think that our bodies tell us so much and store so much. I would love to just hear just a little bit more about that because I think it's something people might be curious about.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert at it.
Of
But
course.
for me, what I have learned is that my stomach kind of finds out about stuff before my head.
Hmm.
Um, so, like when something's emerging, for example, something that doesn't feel right, something I think that I should be concerned about. I think previously I only thought you should use your head. And for me, probably even more, I was very left hemisphere centric, like logic, 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 math, 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 all of that. Um, and the stomach, I'll be just sitting in a room at work or wherever, and I will feel somebody will say something, and I will immediately feel like, that's not that's not right. Or it can even be a positive feeling like, this person's onto something.
Mhm.
And then I kind of make a choice to focus my thoughts on understanding what is that. More than in the past, it would probably need to become a pattern before I would pay attention to it. So I've started kind of just tuning into it. And it helps me make decisions, to be honest, when I'm grappling with really confusing things. I try to tune into what my body is telling me, and that helps guide my decision. Recently, just in a very banal example, my my husband and I almost bought a new house. We have a very old house that has some limitations to our lifestyle, and we've been kind of logically wanting a bigger house with more opportunities. And we found a house, it checked all the boxes logically, and we started the process. And from the very beginning, I knew that my heart was not in this new house, but I
Hmm.
didn't want my heart to decide stuff for me. That seemed too frivolous. So I was like, no, we're going to be logical people. We're going to buy the house that's logical. And then luckily, um, very far into the process, even though that's kind of a big mistake, um, I decided that my heart should have veto power. And
Hmm.
I we pulled out of the decision to buy the new house, and it felt very empowering
Hmm.
to realize. I felt stupid at first, like we just wasted a lot of money doing all this stuff that you do when you try to buy and sell a house. But then I was really happy that I was able to trust myself enough to know that this wasn't the right decision and pull out.
Hmm. I love that example. I'm also curious if there is something that you have come to really, this might be similar to what you just said, but really like about yourself because of some hardship that you've gone through. Is there something that's emerged, a characteristic of yourself that, like, I really like this about myself because it's been built through adversity?
Yeah, I think recently for me, I've come to learn to love my sensitivity.
Hmm.
I am very sensitive, and I have been trying to diagnose that about myself. For a while, I was diagnosed as autistic about 4 years ago, which is probably true, for multiple reasons that I won't go into now. Lots of women aren't diagnosed with that. Also looking at all the trauma, potential trauma factors from childhood, all of the psychology. Also struggling with mental health, like I talked about earlier, also feeling the weight of the world on me kind of thing. And I think eventually going to this therapist and saying, I just want tools to fix this. Like, I want to fix this. Why does my life have to be so hard? Everything seems easy for everybody else. And then I think that the kind of pin drop moment for me was when she said, you need to just recognize the fact that your life is going to be hard. Mm-hmm. And that's actually also like comes with the territory of being you and having the values that you have. And through that, I think I also started kind of flipping the narrative myself and saying, okay, this sensitivity that I've been kind of investigating by saying, what is wrong with me? What if I flip that around and say, what is good about this? Like I feel stuff in my bones. Like if someone's being unethical, like it hurts my body. I feel if I watch too much of the news in the world, I become like paralyzed with pain in my heart, in my chest. But how can I actually realize that those things are maybe not problems? There is actually a strength. My sensitivity is also what I use when I'm working with teams to be able to read a room like that. I'm like a canary in a coal mine. I can be in a room for 10 minutes and tell you the dynamics of the team very accurately. So I think that's come from some adversity, probably. Yeah.
I love how you talked about what if the thing that I think is, a not so great part of me is actually a strength. I love that. I've never heard anyone say that before. I really love that you said that. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I loved this conversation. I hope it gives people things to think about as they lead themselves and their families and their places of work. So thank you. It was wonderful to spend time with you.
Thank you, Jessica. It was really nice to catch up and to talk with you as well.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Heartstrong. I hope you found today's episode inspiring and applicable to your life. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Before I go, this is just a quick reminder that I believe in you, and I believe that you too have the ability to become heartstrong. I'll chat with you soon.